Well, as it happens, Ray and I are picking up where we left off last night.
Yes.
Because no sooner had he arrived, highly contagious at the ABC, that we got stuck into it. The fellow sitting beside me, you know, is the mayor of New Orleans, and incidentally, there are 100 ways to pronounce it, and they're all okay, aren't they?
Yes, they're all okay.
We went through dozens of them. But you're also looking at Cinderella. This may come as a surprise, but it's perfectly true. To me, the most enchanting thing about the mayor is that he was born in the New Orleans Charity Hospital to a very poor family, and his dad was juggling 3 or 4 jobs, one of which was a janitor at the City Hall, never realising that the boy who had just sort of arrived in the charity hospital would one day be its boss. It hasn't all, however, been Cinderella stuff. There was this terrible moment, of course, with Katrina, when the lovely coach was turned into a squashed pumpkin. But as it's been pointed out, somehow, against all odds, he got himself re-elected. I remember vividly you erupting on the screen, enraged by the lack of response from Washington.
Yes.
You gave George W. no quarter. Let me start at the end, therefore. To what extent did New Orleans provide a nail for the Bush coffin? When the election arrived...
Any Republicans in the room? You know, I think that's a very interesting question. You know, from my perspective, I don't think the Bush administration ever recovered from Katrina. If it was a nail in the coffin, I'm not sure, but it surely was an event that they were on the defensive from right after Katrina. I can remember being involved in the struggle right after Katrina, and you know, as politicians do in the United States, they were making claims and they were doing all sorts of things. The Bush administration was claiming that everything was okay. Our governor was saying that. And finally, I'd had enough because I was there and I was watching the people suffer. So I started cussing. And after I finished, it was a very emotional speech, and I think it was carried on radio all over the world. I thought I was a dead man. I really did. I thought that the Secret Service was going to swoop in and, you know, inject me with something, and 6 months later, I would have been dead. But I think that was a defining moment that the Bush administration struggled with. And in reality, Katrina exposed the soft underbelly of poverty, race, classism in America, and it caused America to look at itself differently. And I think as a result of that, when Obama came on the scene, America was looking to mature and looked at him for what he was, and not necessarily for the color of his skin, because so many people in New Orleans suffered that were African American. And Bush had a tough time, but I think it allowed America to grow a little bit and to mature to a different level.
I don't want to dwell on the presidential roles in this, but you've always been a bit of a loose cannon politically.
Yes.
Although you have Democrat traditions,
yes.
you were no enthusiast for Kerry, were you?
Well, I ended up supporting Kerry, and that was an interesting ride. He was not the most dynamic candidate. I was still not sure how he lost to Bush the second time Bush ran, and you know, Bush ended up getting, I think, 2 million more votes than he got the first time, and we know about the Chad situation in Florida. So the Democratic Party played a different game back then than the Republicans. The Republicans are very aggressive. They play to win. And I think they underestimated President Obama this time. He played a little harder and won.
Let's talk about the catastrophe that overwhelmed you. And you're sitting in a room full of people who are very familiar with catastrophe. Australia has fights above its weight in natural disasters. We're used to hurricanes, we're used to floods, we're used to bushfires. And they're getting more intense as a consequence of climate change, and I know you're not a denier that you see this as a factor. But there were a couple of ingredients in what overwhelmed your city that were not natural disasters, but in effect man-made. One of them was that gradually the wetlands had been destroyed, which had acted as a buffer zone from time immemorial. And the other was that the levees were not particularly well constructed. Now, I understand that you're looking at the wetlands issue now to see whether, to some extent, they can be rehabilitated. Tell the audience a story about Christmas trees.
Well, you know, before we get to Christmas trees, the wetlands provide an extra barrier of protection from hurricanes. For every mile of wetlands that we have, it subsides a foot of storm surge. And, you know, I think I said this earlier, hurricanes are about wind and rain, but they're really about the storm or the water that it's pushing. And because our wetlands have been destroyed, if you will, over the past century, I think we've lost 900 square miles, and we were projected to lose another 500 over the next 50 years. And Hurricane Katrina came in, and we lost 200 square miles just in one hurricane season. So that hurricane protection system, that backup system, has been decimated pretty well. What we're doing to try and overcome that, we have many different pilot programs that we're starting. We're using treated wastewater, for example, to fertilize certain sections of the Gulf of Mexico, the shallow parts, to restore the barrier islands and to restore the wetlands. So we've got a couple of different projects, but those are longer-term solutions. The real short-term solutions is to build a levee protection system that is much stronger than just an earthen system, but something that has a little armoring, if you will.
Tell us about the Christmas trees.
The Christmas trees. Now, you're really interested in those Christmas trees, huh?
Yeah.
Well, what we do with the Christmas trees is we gather them up after the Christmas season, after they've been used in the home and they've dried out pretty well, and we pretty much put those in the shallow parts of the marshland that we've been fueling with some of the treated wastewater, and it really accelerates the development of marshlands, and it's been proven very successful.
Are you persuaded that the levee rebuilding is up to scratch? Because there are many very powerful authorities that think that they're not going to make it.
Well, all I can tell you is that they're being built to a different standard, a much higher standard. The previous levees that we had during Hurricane Katrina were based upon the previous disaster, which was Hurricane Betsy, which happened in the mid-'60s. Now we have anti-scouring techniques that are being utilized. One of the big issues with Hurricane Katrina is that the storm surge came in and it overtopped the levees, and it really started to dig into the other side of the levee, which weakened them. Now we have concrete anti-scouring techniques and pilings that are being driven 60 to 70 miles into the earth. So it's a better system. Whether it's the ultimate system, I'm not sure. We tested it during the last hurricane season. It passed the test, but we really didn't have another Hurricane Katrina.
It's important to clarify that Katrina wasn't your first hurricane. Not so long ago, not long before it, you had to persuade the population of New Orleans to leave town.
Yes.
Now, this is a very big call to get 800,000 people trying to get out of town in a rush. Apart from the logistics of it, you weren't entirely sure whether the hurricane was going to hit. So on risk assessment, you decided to call for massive movement out of the city. When they tried to get out of town and the hurricane didn't hit, were you the most unpopular bloke in the city?
No, not really, because every hurricane season we will have some type of threat. Most of the time we call for voluntary evacuations. But since Hurricane Katrina, we've called for more mandatory. Most of the time we're right about it, and people should have gotten out. And for the most part, they intelligently understand that. Some citizens didn't leave for Hurricane Katrina and probably won't leave for future events. And that's just something we have to live with. But for the most part, our citizens understand the threat. Now it's getting harder and harder as time goes on, because an evacuation basically puts many stresses on our community. It's a financial stress, and the community or the families go through a lot of stress as it relates to that. But we keep moving forward because we have to, because of the environment that we live in.
I'm interested in that you've got a plan. When evacuation's called for, you reorganise the freeway system. Instantly, it's one-way traffic out.
It's contraflow is what they're called. So every highway, whether it was meant to come into the city or not, is all pointed outside the city.
Many of the people that left last time have not come back. I know you talk about 80% of having 80% of the old population, but quite a few of those, of course, are new people moving in, Mexican workers and so on. How many of the original community of New Orleans from 2005 have not come home?
Well, as best we can tell, it's probably about 20 to 25%, probably on the 25% range. We still have a significant number of our citizens who are living on FEMA assistance still in other parts of the community. For the most part, our lower income citizens are living in other areas of the country because we have pretty much demolished most of the public housing developments that were in New Orleans that concentrated poverty in one particular section of the city. We're moving toward mixed income communities, but until those developments have been completely constructed, those citizens can't really return.
You haven't been able to avoid a degree of gentrification, have you?
Yeah, there's a certain amount, but not as much as some had hoped or some had thought.
A diplomatic answer. Okay, in Australia, we have a habit of doggedly building and indeed rebuilding in very dangerous areas. We put houses in the middle of eucalypts, which are the most fire-prone tree on earth. They actually explode. We build cities on floodplains and wonder why they get flooded out again and again and again. You've taken a non-authoritarian view on this. You've decided that it is not your job to tell people where they must live.
Right.
Is this an easy call? Does that make a complete sense?
I think we do it all over the world. For the most part, we're human beings and we have a certain amount of intelligence. What we did in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, we explained all the risks to our citizens and advised them of those risks, and then went with a market-based approach. And in reality, that approach has proven to be working. For example, the Lower Ninth Ward, which was very famous, is where one of the first breaches happened. For the most part, the section of the Lower Ninth Ward that is the lowest and the most vulnerable, those citizens are not rebuilding in that area. They're building closer to the riverside of the Lower Ninth Ward, which is some of the higher ground. And they are making that decision on their own. So I believe in the spirit of people and their ability to make those kind of decisions. Now, you will have some knucklehead, it's true, that will build a slab-on-grade kind of house and move back into a risky area, but for the most part, there are not too many people like that.
The first powerful industry to decide that climate change wasn't a left-wing plot was the insurance industry. They would be playing, I would have thought, a significant role in modelling the rebuilt New Orleans.
The insurance industry?
Yeah. In other words, who will they insure, where they won't insure?
I have a totally different perspective on that. And I watched the insurance industry put billions and billions of dollars in reserves as it relates to Hurricane Katrina. And then I watched them very skillfully change the rules of the game. And they shifted their risk from one of wind damages to shifting the risk to the federal government so that most of the insurance claims were paid through the federally funded flood insurance program. So they are very smart.
Well, as a reformer, have you been able to beat them into submission? Have you been able to reform them?
No, I've had more than my share of battles and haven't been able to get to that one yet. But that's something that we'll do in the future.
When it happened, the world was persuaded to the view that what we were seeing occurring in New Orleans and not occurring was to some extent race-based. And you certainly said that at the time. With the wisdom of hindsight, do you still hold to that view that had this been a much more white city, there would have been a better response?
I said it was race and class. And I think if it would have been in a much more affluent section of the country, I think it would have been a different response. And now there's starting to be some congressional testimony that confirms that. There's starting to be some Bush administrative people who are starting to come out and say that that was partially the case. And it was unfortunate. And that's why I'm so excited about where America is right now, because
let's keep Obama till later, because
right.
I want to go out on that. Okay, you talked about you were lucky. You thought you were going to get killed. When we last talked, we talked about people who did get killed, and I'm thinking about the Point Algiers story. Now, this is an incredible story where white vigilantes were shooting black people trying to flee the area. Their excuse at the time was that they thought these young people were going to loot, but any analysis of their psychological makeup showed that these were just mad people.
Yeah.
There was the police force was in a total mess.
Yeah.
A lot of them had just disappeared. The prisons had to be opened up to let people out.
Yeah.
So if you were going to murder people, it was a pretty good time to choose, wasn't it?
Well, I didn't murder anyone, so there was some incidents that happened. Keep in mind, just imagine Sydney for a minute, having the worst case scenario happen. 80% of the city is damaged. Every citizen is evacuated because they had to. And in between that time, the worst and the best of your citizens come out. And that's what happened in New Orleans. Some people thought it was the end of the world. Some were protecting their properties, all that they had ever had and owned. And there were some incidents that we as citizens are not proud of today. But that's something that I think is going to be tough to avoid when you have a disaster of that magnitude.
Okay, let's now, before we talk about Obama, let me do this. I want to know how you happened. I told the story about the humble origins of your birth, not much above the manger, really. And here you are, getting elected against all odds. I'm talking about your first election, not the re-election.
Right.
As a reformer. A very tough political environment, long history of corruption.
Yes.
These are head kickers.
Yeah.
How did you do it?
Well, the first time?
The first time.
My message to the public was basically one of economics. The city of New Orleans had been struggling. It really wasn't moving economically. I was a business candidate. They had 14 other candidates who were from the political system. I talked about a different New Orleans, one that basically changed its image, one that started to move economically, and we were able to get it moving in a much better direction. And I appealed to just about every segment of the population that earned, a household that earned $45,000 or above.
So you didn't run a black campaign?
Yeah. It was an economic campaign. As a matter of fact, I received 80% of the crossover vote. It was the first time in history that an African American candidate had received that kind of crossover vote.
So Obama must have learned something from you.
No, I think Obama set the bar a little bit higher than I had. He ran a wonderful campaign.